to Factory Reset, a podcast brought to you by the New Political Economy Initiative at IIT Bombay. From India's industrial shifts to lessons from the world over, our host for the season, Srinivasan Iyer, is unpacking the historical blueprints, the breakthroughs, and the contemporary bold lessons that reset our thinking on the economy.
We have with us today Professor Ha-Joon Chang, who's now with the School of Oriental and African Studies. Thank you, Ha-Joon, for agreeing to this interview.
No, thank you for the invitation.
Let's begin with how you would seek to define industrial policy.
Yeah, actually, the thing about industrial policy is that even the definition of it has been controversial. So at one extreme, there are people who say everything that affects industry, possibly more narrowly manufacturing, is industrial policy. And at the other extreme, there are people who say there is all about this kind of targeting and what some people call vertical policies as opposed to more horizontal policy like, research and development, worker training, and infrastructure. I tend to be close to the second definition. My view is that, if you say everything that affects the industry is industrial policy, then it becomes, definitionally correct, but empty. Yeah?
Because, it covers everything.
Yeah, I mean, even, social welfare policy, the gender equality, these things can affect the industrial performance. So I think that's not a very useful definition. Now, I tend to be close to the second definition, but I don't quite agree with it because this division between horizontal policy and vertical policy or sectoral policy or general policy, this is very artificial because other than possibly primary education, there's no policy that has equal influence on industrial performance at the sectoral level. Huh? Because, for example, people say, the government should just invest in infrastructure, invest in R&D, invest in the education and training, and let the private sector take care of it. But are you really not discriminating between different sectors? If you are giving R&D subsidies, you are promoting sectors that use higher technology, sectors that do lots of R&D. Yeah? So you are actually discriminating in favor of, say, industries like pharmaceutical or electronics against other industries that might be important but do not necessarily do a lot of research and development. For example, the machine tools, things like that. There are industries which require a lot of skills and knowledge and so on, but these skills and knowledge are not necessarily like some things that can be defined as research and development because it's the kind of well-established technologies whose mastery is more important than whether it is brand new or from 5 years ago. Infrastructure, there's no such thing as infrastructure that can help all industries, because first of all, infrastructure is location specific. You are either building the road in the Uttar Pradesh or in Punjab. There's no road that can be once built, transported to another state because suddenly that state has more demand for road. Even if you are building the infrastructure in the same location, what industry benefits from it depends on the kind of infrastructure because even in the same state, same provinces, you could build either, say, an airport that caters for flower growing industry to export fresh flowers to richer countries, or you could use the same money to build a railroad between, I don't know, a copper mine and the seaport. Yeah? And once you build them, you cannot remold them. I mean, you cannot say, oh, suddenly flour demand is rising, so let's roll up these railways and reshape it into another airport. Yeah? So in that sense, this definition between vertical and horizontal, targeted and general, is the artificial. We are always targeting is only a matter of degree. Yeah? How narrowly you are targeting, how broadly you are targeting. So while I define the industrial policy as a policy that tries to kind of change particular sectors, whether it's in relation to the technology it uses or the way it exports or the way it trains workers, trying to influence particular sectors, but it is not this only this targeting kind of thing, and also more importantly, you are promoting certain sectors. Not because, not necessarily because you think there's, the sector is somehow high tech and knowledge intensive or whatever, but because promoting the sector could help raise the productivity for the whole economy. The best example is what countries like Korea did in the 1980s with the textile industry. Huh? It's not a high-tech industry, but the government had a strong program to support this industry, to export, to upgrade technology, so that they were giving, say, subsidized loans to these textile companies that would buy new machines, and stuff like that. And they didn't do it because textile was high-tech, but it was still the biggest export sector, and you need the foreign exchange that this sector generates if you want to develop other industries. Yeah? Because at the time, Korea was still kind of the middle-income country. It needed to import a lot of technologies, whether it's in the form of machines or technology licensing, and you need foreign exchanges. Yeah? So they promoted the textile sector not because it was high-tech or somehow inherently better than other sectors, but it had a role to play in the bigger the scheme of things. Yeah?
It's that bigger scheme of things which distinguishes industrial policy with just a raft of non-industrial, even though it might be. And also,
Exactly, yeah.
Fair enough. If you look around today in countries in the global south, what would be the 5, 6 most important policy instruments which collectively could sort of constitute industrial policy? I ask that because in a lot of discussions, they jump to merely trade openness and tariffs, whereas you've just said and you've written extensively that it's a little more complex than that. So could you sort of list out 5, 6, 7 of the most important policy instruments?
Yeah. So
in the global south. Sorry.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there are kind of very well-known tools of industrial policy. One is trade measures. So tariffs are the best known, but it could also involve banning imports of certain things, which Japan, Korea, Taiwan did a lot in the 60s and 70s. The British and the Americans did in the
when they needed it.
Whenever
they
exactly,
needed it.
In the 18th, 19th century. It could also involve requiring that, Brazil has this local law equivalence, which means that if you can get something domestically, you cannot import things as a matter of course. I mean, you have to get a permission to do that and explain why the domestic product is not equivalent to what you are trying to, So trade measures has been the most the widespread because a lot of countries have used the industrial policy basically to engage in the international catching up. I mean, if you want to get into kind of better industries that will raise your productivity, create better jobs, and so on, you need to basically protect your local producers from international competition by definition, because you're an economically backward country, and you need to do that in the same way that you are raising your children and not send them to the labor market when they are 5 or 6. This idea is, of course, widely known and widely used, although many people don't realize that the guy who invented this argument was an American, and not just any American. It was the very first finance minister of the United States of America, or what they call the Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, who invented the term infant industry. Anyway, so the trade measures has always been important, but the subsidies have also played an important role. These subsidies could be used to provide basically protection to domestic producers against foreign competition. So you may not have the trade protection, but you may subsidize these companies so that they can offer lower prices than the foreign companies and so on. It could be used to encourage the private sector companies to do things that they would not do because of the market signals that don't encourage them. So the research and development, worker training, and things like that, or there could be a situation where companies are stuck with outdated technology, but no company wants to make the first move to upgrade to a better technology because it may be outcompeted in those the transition period. Because if you install better machines and so on, eventually you will be more competitive. But for the first couple of years, that's right. There is a disadvantage because other people will undercut you with the cheaper products, maybe lower quality, but it's still cheaper. So in that kind of situation, the governments have offered these subsidized loans to companies to upgrade the machines and technologies. I mean, as I explained to you earlier with the Korean textile sector example. So the subsidies can be used for different purposes, but trade measures, especially tariffs and then subsidies, and then of course for the developing countries or countries in the global south, restrictions or regulations on the foreign direct investment is very important. I'm not against the hosting foreign companies or going into the joint ventures. But the problem is that if you just let them do whatever they want, they are not going to give you better technologies. They are not going to source inputs from local producers. They are not going to train your workers. So countries after country have used regulations to demand that these companies do a huge range of things that basically are geared towards strengthening domestic productive capabilities. So it could be requirement for joint ventures. It could be that could involve usually banning the majority ownership by the foreign companies. It could be what are known as local contents requirement. It could be related to exporting requirement, because sometimes multinational companies, what they do is that they invest in a developing country and they keep producing second-rate products with outdated technologies that cannot be used at home or to make things to export to other developed countries. So countries like Korea, Taiwan, they have put conditions. You have to export more than a certain proportion of your output, basically to make them use more updated technologies. You know? So you can't use a huge range of measures to basically sometimes cajole, sometimes force foreign companies to kind of build the productive capabilities in your own borders. If you don't do that, you end up being kind of screwdriver the economy. Yeah? I mean, the Philippines is the best example. At least according to one indicator, it's the most high-tech economy in the world. Yeah? If you go to the World Bank website, you will find that there's this data on the proportion of high-tech products, according to Sanjay Lal definition, proportion of high-tech exports in manufacturing export. Yeah? And Philippines is by far the highest, like 65%. Yeah, I mean South Korea is 35. America's 25. Singapore is similar to Korea, but Philippines is 65. Yeah, Korea 35. But despite that, the Philippines has $30,000 $500 per capita income. South Korea is $3,500 per capita income. South Korea has 35,000 per capita income because even though the product they export might be high tech, I mean, what the Filipino workers are doing is just
little value back home.
That's right. Yeah, just putting things together, putting them in boxes. Yeah,
for the screwdriver.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean you have all these measures related to foreign direct investment, and then I mean the intellectual property the policies have been very important measures of industrial policy. Sometimes it took a more kind of passive form, like basically not implementing the intellectual property right laws rigorously, so that local firms can copy and reverse engineer and
the Indian pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah, but I think that the Indian example was went one step further, because what happened was that in the beginning, India had kind of standard pharmaceutical law, which allowed the product patent as well as a process patent. Yeah. But in the 70s, I think you abolished the product patent.
That's right.
Which a lot of people these days find strange, but this was the norm in the old days until the 1960s and 70s, even in the rich countries. Yeah? Because the long-held view, the long time more dominant than the current view, was the view that when it comes to chemicals, including pharmaceuticals, what the so-called inventor has done is to find the process to isolate what already exists in nature.
Yes.
It isn't as if that guy invented
that element.
Yeah, element. Yeah. So actually, until the 60s, most advanced countries didn't give product patent. So, I mean, that's how, for example, especially the Swiss pharmaceutical industry grew, yeah, because at the time, the leader of pharmaceutical industry in Europe was Germany, and basically the Swiss companies, because Switzerland didn't have a patent law,
they copied them.
Stole, the German technologies center, left, and right. But at the time, actually, even Germany didn't have a product patent. Yeah, so it was only the process. Yeah, so Bayer invented aspirin, but aspirin is based on the European folk remedy. I mean,
from the willow plant.
That's right, willow bark. Yeah, you boil it and you drink it. So Bayer found a way to isolate it, but it wasn't like Bayer invented willow tree. So yeah, so these IPR policies have been used sometimes very actively, like in the case of India in the 70s, because by abolishing product patent, you encourage the growth of huge, what is commonly known as generic pharmaceutical manufacturing industry. Yeah? And so these are like the better known tools, but when you look at countries like South Korea and especially Japan, I mean, they did a lot more things. So one of them was basically the policies regarding, if you like, investment coordination. Yeah? So we've heard about the so-called big push, coordination. So rather than trying to promote the particular sectors in isolation, you try to build them together so that they sell and buy from each other. Well-known argument, but these countries also coordinated competing investment. Yeah?
Oh.
So Japan was the master at it. So what it did was to organize this private sector enterprise into what they called investment cartels. Yeah? So cartels were generally illegal, but with government sanction, you could run cartels. So basically what they did was to say that, okay, we have 6 steel producers. We don't want them to invest all at the same time and flood the market. So we are going to give you the tons. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So this year is the Mitsubishi Steel. Next year is New Nippon Steel. 2 years later is someone else. Yeah. So they actually coordinated competing as well as complementary investment. Also, these governments were deeply involved in the industrial restructuring. So, even with the best investment coordination, sometimes, you have excess capacity. For example, South Korea built a big aluminum processing plant in the 70s when oil was cheap. Yeah? And then suddenly oil price went by 4 times. It didn't make sense because the most important input in the processing of aluminum is the energy, not bauxite. Yeah?
Yeah.
So they had to, kind of arrange a merger between the existing companies because there was excess capacity. Sometimes it could involve the government-owned banks. Well, at the time, actually, all the banks were owned by the government until 1983. But especially the Korea Development Bank, it was involved in so many of these restructurings. Going into the kind of bankrupt but important enterprises and sorting it out, and then sometimes privatizing them afterwards, sometimes keeping them in the state ownership. Yeah? There were also the cases where, in Japan, especially in the 1970s and 80s, the government was involved in negotiated capacity scrapping. So, for example, the shipbuilding industry and steel industry, because they invested so much in the 60s, and then there was an oil shock and entry of countries like Korea into those markets, and the government, well, not just the government and the industry all realized that they need to cut capacity, but then no one wanted to cut it first. Yeah? So the government went in and said, okay, we are going to work out some formula. You guys have just installed most productive new capacities. So we are going to give you a bit of slack. Yeah? But even you have to cut the capacity by 20%. Everyone else, the 40% or whatever. Yeah? Or they also, in some industries, did things like, okay, overall we have to cut the 30%, but smaller firms would find it more difficult to deal with such cuts. So we are going to make them cut only 20%. Larger guys have to cut 40%. Yeah. So all this industrial restructuring policy, which very few people actually even know about, not to speak of talking about. It was very, very important in the East Asian the countries. Yeah?
So it's not really de-risking investment, but it's actually market shaping. Which players are in the
Absolutely,
market,
yeah,
to what
yeah.
extent,
Yeah.
entry, exit,
Exactly.
the
The
rules of
game
game.
was completely different. I mean, now that when people talk about de-risking, basically that means the private sector doing whatever it wants and then the government cleaning up after them. Yeah, it wasn't like that. I mean, it was like
It was shaping economic
sure,
actors,
yeah,
shaping the rules
exactly.
of the
Yeah,
game.
from the beginning, that you say we want to promote these industries. We are going to do it this way. We are going to give you this much help in terms of trade protection, subsidies, or whatever. But if things go wrong, we may cancel your license. We'll kick you out. You know, we'll force you to cut capacity if necessary. You know, and then on top of these the big kind of structural things, of course, you need policies regarding research and development, skills formation, and training and retraining. Of course, all of these had to be targeted. Of course, some policies were more general than others, so they would be, general the tax credit for the physical investment or R&D, but
Exporters.
yeah, exporters. Yeah, but sometimes they were very targeted. Like we want to develop, I don't know, I mean, the supercomputer technologies in Japan in the 70s, yeah? And then we are going to give you money if you do this, do that, yeah? I mean, we need more workers with these kind of skills, so we are going to set up new engineering departments, set up the skills development institutes, yeah? Or even the mandate that large firms do certain amount of training. Huh?
So they both picked winners, and in the earlier cases also picked losers and got them to exit.
Exactly, yeah, yeah. So I mean, I think the picking winners is actually a bit of a misleading expression. It's more like making winners. Yeah?
Market shaping rather than
Exactly,
picking
yeah,
winners.
yeah.
No, thanks for that. Now, coming to today's world, when we look at the global south, do you see sort of typologies or groups of countries for which industrial policy might play out very differently from, say, other groups rather than look at global south as a block?
Yeah. No, I agree that the thing about industrial policy is that very kind of it has to be targeted. I mean, in different degrees, that has to be targeted if it's going to work, because it's not like, I don't know, social welfare policy. When it comes to human beings, we are all very similar. Yeah, we are born, we have to be educated, we grow old, and we have to go to school, we get sick, we have children, Okay, I mean, there's variation, but the variation is much, much smaller. So social policy, in my view, has to be universal.
Cookie cutter.
Yeah. It has to be universal, but when it comes to industrial policy, these industries are so different. Yeah? I mean, you cannot use the same policy between, I don't know, the huge, kind of, say, shipyards and, artisanal workshops that are making kind of sophisticated, customized products. I mean, so you need very different policies for different industries. And this means that different countries who choose to develop different sectors will have to have different policies. And also that different countries have many different conditions in terms of natural resource endowment, size of the country, geography, the skill base, and basically you have to have very different policies for very different countries. Although, I mean, there are some basic principles. Yeah? So if you try to look at the countries of the global south today, of course, you can kind of classify them in a number of different ways. So it will be like, I don't know, 3 by 3 by 3, 4 by
matrix.
6. Yeah, the kind of the multi-dimensional matrix. But, for example, I think one thing that we commonly do, which, actually, even though it's quite, blunt kind of instrument, but I think it's important, is to classify these countries as, upper middle income, lower middle income, low income, least developed. Yeah, here, of course, the correlation is not perfect, but there's a strong correlation between your level of income and your kind of productive capabilities. Of course, there are countries which, hit the oil bonanza and suddenly have like, the $15,000 per capita income without really having much skill, to produce anything. But in general, there's a kind of difference. So, for example, if you're a, the least developed country, the priority will be to, make your people educated and healthy and provide basic services, lay the basic infrastructure. And at that stage, I'm of the view that you probably don't need a lot of industrial policy, because given your kind of the productive capabilities, there are only probably a few sectors that you can realistically develop. So probably the weight of the policy should be more about the social policy, education, general infrastructure rather than the very targeted infrastructure. But even there, I think that you have to start building your productive capabilities, which means that you have to decide to concentrate on certain industries, because the different sectors have the very different requirements in terms of productive capabilities. Yeah? Some of them would require kind of, if you want to, I don't know, succeed in the agro processing, the infrastructure is much more important, because you need to have good roads and the storage facilities, refrigeration facilities. In the early 2000s, doing some research on agricultural policy, I was shocked to find that at that time, 40% of India's fruit and vegetables rot away.
Yes.
So if you want to develop those kind of industries, you need really focus on the infrastructure. If you want to develop chemical industries, it will require totally different types of facilities and workers and engineers from when you're trying to develop electronics. Yeah? So you need to, even at that stage, begin to think, what do we want to do? Yeah.
I guess India, Indonesia, Egypt, these are all complex economies, large, diversified. Part of India, 10% of India may be in the upper middle income bracket. The others are worse in sub-Saharan Africa.
That's right, yeah. No, actually,
problems.
in the 80s, the late MIT economist, then used called Lance Taylor, wrote this famous article called Belindia, The Economics of Belindia, which was about Brazil. Yeah, he wrote it with this Brazilian economist, Edmund Bacha. So their view was that Brazil was Belgium superimposed on India. Yeah? Today, India is probably the Ethiopia,
That's right.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah, so that means that, yes, not just the level of income. You need to think about the size and complexity of the economy, because what you have to do if you are, the Mauritius with 1.2 million people is very, very different from what you have to do with the countries like India or Indonesia. And then, the political structure also matters, because there are some federal countries, unitary countries.
Yeah, or even in Rwanda, which went for tourism and call centers, as against in Ethiopia, which went somewhere else,
That's right, yeah.
and so on. But that brings me to a set of cookie cutter policies which you've spoken about, which is the whole business about governance and institutions, which is often proffered as a panacea for development. What would you have to say on that?
Yeah, I think this discussion of governance is, I mean, of course, the kind of more honest way to talk about this is to talk about power and conflict and compromises and social pacts and so on, because governance is such a vague term. But yes, I mean I get it. I mean they want to talk about these things, but mainstream economists and UN officials do not quite want to use the language of power and conflict, so they get to use these vague terms. But insofar as these governance issues are discussed, I think the problem is that people who emphasize the importance of good governance, they got the kind of causality wrong, yeah? Because their view is that get governance right and then market will solve all the problems. Yeah, these countries are not developing because there's too much corruption. Yeah, rules are opaque. There are too many red tapes. Yeah, so that you have all these businessmen who are rearing to go, but when they try to export something, some obscure rules that hit you, and things are wrote in the port, and I mean, when you try to start a new business, it takes 55 days to register. This is the view behind the famous World Bank's the ease of doing business indicator. So this view is that basically that you have this energy in the private sector in developing countries, which could burst
animal spirits
out. That's right. Yeah, only if these countries had but fewer crimes, fewer corruption. But my view is that, of course, I'm not kind of necessarily going to the other extreme.
You're not arguing for crime, but
yeah. But basically, you have to realize that there's a very complex interaction between your economic development and your governance structure, and then practices. Because if you, I documented some of this in my book, Kicking the Ladder. If you don't have to go back too far. I mean, go back only like 100 years, 70 years. I mean, today's rich countries who love to lecture India and other developing countries about governance and corruption, I mean, they were even more corrupt than, until the 19th century, in all the European countries, you didn't even have to have legal training to be a judge. Yeah. Yeah, Americans openly sold offices. They still do. I mean that all these ambassadors to small countries from the U.S. I mean, these are people who have no qualification to be ambassadors
in diplomacy.
That's right. Yeah, they have those jobs only because they donated good sums of money to the winning presidential candidate.
Kind of bounty.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the Americans had a specific word for that. It was called the spoils system. Yeah. So the spoils of war, spoils of the election. Yeah. So, I mean, even today, I heard that something like 10,000 jobs change hands in the American government.
If change in regime.
Yeah. I mean, they have very weak professional civil service. Yeah. Anyway, so you know, so the interaction is complex because you need some minimal degree of the stability and security, and things like that to develop the economy. But these things improve as your economy develops. Yeah.
So you're saying it's neither necessary nor sufficient. It's a useful thing, but it's neither
That's right,
necessary
yeah.
nor sufficient.
Yeah. So I'm all in favor of greater transparency and greater democratic influence and so on. But basically, if you begin to think that these countries first need to sort out their governance before they can develop, then I mean you will have to wait forever, because I mean these things are costly. I mean, if you want to have a professional civil service, you need the kind of people and resources to run objective assessment system, good the evaluation system, I mean, they cost money, and if you want to get rid of corruption, of course, it's impossible to get rid of corruption completely. But if you want to reduce it to minimum, then you need a lot of inspectors and the legal resources to find and punish these people.
To contain that.
Yeah.
Let's now turn to.
Let me just add one thing. Yeah. The kind of. So actually, I think this governance argument has been unfortunately used as an excuse by neoliberal economists to explain away their failure with policies. Because in the 80s, early 90s, the World Bank, the IMF, the professors from top US and UK universities, they all went to the developing countries and said, do these policies, it will improve your economy, open the trade, open the investment, deregulate, privatize, weaken the labor regulations, weaken the environmental regulations. And then this policy package, commonly known as Washington Consensus Policy, has failed to work. The developing countries, developing world has been growing more slowly in the last 4 decades of neoliberalism than during the bad old days of import substitution in the 60s and 70s, especially countries in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa, which were forced to implement Washington Consensus policies more rigorously than other developed countries because they were in the weaker economic positions. In the 60s and 70s, per capita income in Latin America used to grow at 3.1% per year. In the last 40 years, it has grown at not even one quarter of it, 0.8%. Per capita income in sub-Saharan Africa grew at 1.6% during the 60s and 70s. Now, in the last 40 years, it has grown at 0.3%, 0.4%.
Really positive.
Yeah. So having all these things failed, suddenly they are blaming...
Looking for a new villain.
Yeah, blaming the countries, basically. I mean, we gave you the right policies. The reason why it didn't work was because you are corrupt. Yeah, because you are obstructionist. Yeah.
Let's turn to contemporary conditions. The set of policies that you said that you'd earlier listed out, which includes around trade, around fiscal measures, around targeted investment. In today's world, and you could pick and choose the features of today's world, would you want to assess how these will work in the sectors which are really talked about, including high-tech sectors such as semiconductors and advanced digital technologies, or even the earlier low-tech, which could include sort of agriculture and the labor-intensive sectors. Specifically, in fact, what you've also written about, which is globally fragmented production of global value chains, and financialization, the increasing investment, or the separation of financial capital from other forms of capital, and the increasing influence. And within that, what you just mentioned 5 minutes ago, which is the nature of power in these social phenomena. So, given all of this in today's world, how would you assess even the likelihood of industrial policy that we observe today to meet whatever the nation might set as objectives for themselves? What's the likelihood of them working?
Yeah, so I say that compared to the 60s, 70s, and 80s, three things that, well, I mean, almost everything have changed, but there have been three most important changes. One is the establishment of new global rules of trade and investment represented by the WTO, but also supplemented by the bilateral and regional agreements like NAFTA between US, Canada, and Mexico, or the EU's the agreement with the poor countries, so-called the economic partnership agreements with, well, they are former colonies, basically. So that's the first change. And the second change is the rise of so-called global value chains, different form of production. We'll get to the details in a minute. And the third is financialization. Basically, the dominance of the financial logic in the management of not just the financial sector, but people's everyday lives, as well as how industries are organized and developed. So in terms of global rules of trade and investment, a lot of people have argued that, whatever good, well, at least allegedly good industrial policies that countries like Japan, Korea, Taiwan used in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we cannot use them anymore because the WTO
has outlawed them.
Outlaws, almost all of them. Well, first of all, this is not true. First, it's not as if everything was allowed under the old GATT regime. I mean, there were restrictions. And, Taiwan was not a member of GATT, but, Japan, especially Korea, they had to kind of cheat a lot. And also that when you're at the insignificant developing country like Korea was until the 70s, I mean, they're not going to bother to find out what you're doing. I mean, you just do it under the radar. So, it's not as if everything was possible. But yes, I mean, second, it is true that things have become more difficult. But I think people who say this exaggerate the extent of the new restrictions. I often joke that the WTO has become the best friend of lazy government officials in developing countries, because when your minister asks you to do something, all you have to say is, minister is banned by the WTO. The minister is not going to go through 800 pages of WTO agreement and tell you, no, actually you can do it. Why don't you go and do it? So, I mean, there's a lot of lazy, pessimistic assumptions. First of all, when it comes to tariffs, there are a lot of countries, especially the poorest countries, that didn't even bind their tariffs. What the WTO did was not to ban tariffs itself, but to force countries to declare that we are going to put ceilings on our tariffs.
An upper bound.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of poor countries that didn't bind their tariffs. Some countries didn't bind anything, but I mean, lots of countries bound, 10% of their tariff lines, yeah. And even countries that bound all or most of their products, like India, Brazil, they bound it at a relatively high level, 25 to 30%. Yeah? Despite this, today's average tariff rate, industrial tariff rate in developing countries is about 10%. Yeah?
So not even the space
No,
WTO
yeah.
provides.
So actually, there's a kind of technical jargon that WTO negotiators use, which is called water. Yeah? So there's the water between what your apply rate and your bound rate. Yeah? A lot of water. Yeah. So of course that it's not simply because these countries are stupid or they do not understand what the WTO rules are, or that their government officials are more Catholic than the Pope, as they say in Latin America, that they are not leaving a lot of water between the bound rate and the applied rate. It's also because there's huge pressure on these countries from the IMF, World Bank, bilateral donors not to use the high tariffs. Yeah. And I mean, the financial markets probably not as rigorous about this as the World Bank or the U.S. government, but they also take a dim view of countries that use high tariffs. So there is a lot of explicit and implicit pressure on these countries not to use it. But still, I mean, I think they can use more. Yeah? I mean, I'm not saying that they have to raise it to 90% like it used to be, but in some sectors at least, a bit more support through tariff would be helpful. And I mean, there are lots of other restrictions in the WTO that technically the jargon is actionable. So what happens in the WTO is that WTO itself is not in the business of policing countries. Yeah? So countries get taken to the arbitration court. The problem with that court is another matter, but the countries are taken to the arbitration court by their trading partners who believe that their particular trade policies have injured the trading partners' interest. Yeah? So even if you use these policies, if someone doesn't take you to the arbitration court, you don't need to do anything. Yeah? Once the arbitration court rules that yes, you have broken the rule, then the trading partner is allowed to kind of impose sanctions commensurate to the damage. But until that happens, I mean, there are lots of steps. Yeah. Anyway, so what happens is that there are quite a lot of restrictions that the rich countries on measures that rich countries like to use, which are technically actionable, but have not been seriously challenged in the WTO. For example, R&D subsidy. As far as I know, there's no country that has been taken to the arbitration court on the matter of R&D subsidy, because all the countries that usually take other countries to the arbitration court, the US, EU, Japan, they use them. Yeah. So same with agricultural subsidies. Yeah? I mean, they love agricultural subsidies, so they don't take each other to the court. Yeah. So why can't developing countries also use some of those? Yeah?
In fact, quite the contrary. In India, the TRIPS, the patent law that was passed in the mid-2000s exceeds what's required under TRIPS in terms of both compulsory licensing as well as evergreening. Exceeds. So, so there is more to what you say in terms of other interests governing what they can do and what they can't do.
Yeah, so, my view is that yes, I mean, more restricted than before, but it's not as if there's nothing you can do. Also, in the recent years, because of their desire to push China behind, these countries,
Trading partners.
the EU and the US, they have started using industrial policy measures which directly violate the WTO rules. Yeah. So, for example, in the Inflation Reduction Act, the American government is giving subsidies to customers who buy electric cars, provided that they are made with certain amount of inputs produced in the U.S., thereby breaking the rule on the local contents requirement. Yeah?
Yes.
I mean, the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, or CBAM, it is also a potential violation of tariff rules. Yeah. So because these countries are now doing this, developing countries could,
they find more. They can find more space.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and they could also ideologically free themselves a bit more, because now that these guys are doing all this stuff, we can. Of course, the truth of the matter is that these countries have always used industrial policy disguised as something else. Yeah. So the Americans used to run huge industrial policy, only that it was called defense policy, and it would fund and subsidize all kinds of technological research and development on the ground that these are for defense uses. But once the technology come into being, I mean, exactly, yeah. So that's how they have been doing it. So, I mean, I'm not saying that they suddenly started doing the industrial policy, but A, they are doing more, and B, they are doing it more explicitly. So why don't we developing countries say, okay, I mean, if you are like that, why not us? Yeah. So I think that on these trade rules, I think that we need more kind of, if you like, cunning approach. Yeah? I mean, rules are there, but all rules have to be interpreted and applied. And then these countries are rich countries that are breaking these rules, center, left, and right. Try to. I'm not saying that breaking the rules for the sake of breaking the rules is a good thing, but try to identify some policies that you really think you need, and then try to see whether, first of all, you can do it through other measures that are not kind of relevant for the WTO, because let's not forget is WTO rules are kicking only when it concerns trade. Yeah. So there are a lot of domestic policies like those enterprise restructuring policies that I talked about. Yeah. Or the tax credits or subsidies to physical investment or worker training that you can use without breaking any of these rules. Yeah? And then if you think you really need to use these measures that break WTO rules, try to see whether you can kind of repackage the policy in such a way that it doesn't break the rules. And thirdly, if it really has to be broken, you break it, and then deal with the consequences later. Yeah?
That's quite subversive.
Yeah. No, but I mean, that's how all kind of
nations have transformed.
Yeah. I mean, they all did it this way. I mean, suddenly they are saying, time out. Now you cannot do it like that anymore. I mean, especially if you look at things like the history of intellectual property rights. I mean, it's full of thefts and kind of the scams, and I mean, in the 18th century, France had this government job called the Inspector General for Manufacturing or something, and his main job was to run industrial spies. Yeah.
Industrial espionage.
To go and steal technologies from the British and the Germans. Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, So that's the first the issue, and then the global value chains. So the industries have become really organized differently compared to 70s and the 80s because usually they were all kind of vertically integrated in a nation. So even if, say, Ford invests in, say, Brazil to make its cars, of course, put the factories in the developing countries, they would import a lot of inputs. But I mean, the ideal was that everything will be
in country.
That's right. Yeah. Now, I mean, things are organized completely differently. I mean, in the run-up to the Brexit debate in this country, I saw this very interesting article. Was it in the Financial Times or the Guardian, which talked about this car part, which crossed borders 5 times before it got fitted into the car. Yeah, because I mean, I'm making it up, but one factory in Britain produces this small thing, which is then sent to Belgium to be fitted into another bigger thing, which is then sent to France to be fitted into another thing, and so on. So, and then coming back to Britain to be fitted into another thing, and then So, now down to the last element, we have broken down the production process, and then we try to produce the things at locations that give you the cheapest cost. Now, of course, this has, as revealed by the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine and so on, I mean, has led to the
rethinking.
global supply chain that is extremely efficient but extremely fragile. Because the one thing goes wrong and then the whole thing falls apart. And also this is not discussed very much, but it's not simply the largest companies which have this high market shares, but there are some companies that produce these intermediate inputs that no one's heard of. That has a very high market share. So, for example, in the aftermath of the famous earthquake in Japan, the Fukushima, I came across this very interesting small article hidden somewhere in the Financial Times, which was saying that in the region, one of the factories that was destroyed was producing this chemical that they need to use to process the microchips for mobile phones. I don't even know what the technology is. I don't even remember the name of the chemical. Apparently, this one factory in Japan was producing 70% of it. So for a while, I mean, there was a terrible shortage with this chemical, and the kind of production of mobile phone was severely affected. So when you have this kind of organization of production, I mean, if everything runs smoothly, it's great because this the Japanese company must have been the best in the world to be able to have 70% market share. But what happens if that gets destroyed? So I think that we have created this the very complicated structure that is quite vulnerable. So now there's a greater recognition that we need to make it more resilient. We need redundancies in the system and so on.
But that's today. But you've written that there's an asymmetry of power. There always has
absolutely.
been.
Yeah.
So that's an issue that the global South needs to
So
consider.
this new global value chain has created both opportunities and challenges to developing countries, because opportunities in the sense that now that the production processes are so chopped up, you can be part of the global automobile industry by producing one small part. and selling to the top global companies like, I don't know, Toyota, Volkswagen, Hyundai, you know. So in that sense, this is an opportunity that was unheard of before. But on the whole, I think this has made economic development of developing countries more difficult because now you may find it easy to join the value chain, but it is far more difficult to upgrade within the chain. Yeah? So, for example, in the early days of global value chain, you know, the countries like South Korea and Taiwan, especially electronics, played the role of the last link. Yeah? They were doing the screwdriver operation. Yeah? They were assembling cheap transistor radios for Japanese companies, the TVs for American companies. But while they were doing that, they also had a national plan and industrial policy and corporate strategy and ambition to upgrade to, you know, the top of the value chain. And the most interesting example of that is the Korean electronics company LG, which is now the leader in the display. Yeah? LG started out as the lowest the assembler in the global TV value chain controlled by RCA. Yeah? And when RCA went bankrupt around 2010, a huge chunk of it was bought by LG. Yeah?
Wow.
Yeah, so it's like the lowest tenant farmer coming back to the landlords, the family 35 years later and buying 70% of the land. Yeah?
Or a slave buying the plantation.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, so, you know, in the old days, with appropriate support from national government, you could do this thing. But now power is so concentrated in the global chain, the value chain, into these top the multinational companies, is very difficult for these the countries, the developing countries to develop and control their own value chain. Yeah, because countries companies like LG have done is essentially creating their own value chain and controlling it. Yeah? So I think this, on the one hand, means you need actually stronger industrial policy, yeah? Because the companies at the top of the chain are not really going to help you upgrade. Yeah? So you need more restrictions on the foreign investment. You know, China has done that, not officially, because I mean, it's a member of the WTO and so on, but you know, unofficially, a lot of companies have made concessions to China because the market is so attractive. You just cannot ignore what they want. So while China has much fewer laws demanding this and that from foreign investors, they actually
Voluntarily offer that.
That's right. Yeah. So you need a stronger industrial policy, but secondly, it might mean that you need to kind of temper your ambition because it's going to be difficult, except for countries like India. Yeah?
But even India, for example, the garment sector, which I've studied a bit closely, India is only marginally better than Bangladesh in terms of retaining value. So, of the retail price, say, of a garment which is produced significantly in India, wages would be less than 25%. You know, it would range between 12 to about 21%.
Wow.
Bangladesh, given the composition of exports, in fact, it's between 8 to 15%. It's as low as that. So, on the one hand, distribution of value. On the other hand, even the potential for technological transformation is limited because the decisions are taken by the global majors. So in that context, how does the government ensure reciprocity in terms of domestic influence, in terms of technology, diffusion, in terms of value retained in a context like this, other than China, which is a unique case?
Yeah, but India, has, of course, a lot of this has been eroded in the last couple of decades, but it has a lot of the inherent strength in terms of industrial capabilities. Yeah? Let's not forget that that overall it's a poor country, but there's the high-tech part, IIT, there is a country that could use its the big domestic market, uses the labor force that's at least in the relevant segment, better trained than those in Bangladesh or the Myanmar or Vietnam. Yeah, and it has the great strength in the research and development, at least in some sectors like pharmaceutical and so on. And you'll have to take advantage of those to get the best concession from the multinational companies. Yeah.
So that remains a challenge today, and I'm sure the challenge varies across, whether it's in India, which has a diversified and fairly sophisticated economic structure, or maybe even smaller countries which may not have that. The role of the state becomes center if one wants industrial transformation to have this technology spillovers or value retention. That seems to underline what you said all along.
Yeah. So the countries like Singapore, which at the beginning was just colonial trading port, managed to reach the level of per capita income of Sweden and Denmark. Something like $55,000. South Korea is only 35,000. It's way ahead. On the basis of course, they have very strong state-owned enterprise sector. Over 20% of GDP is produced by them. Yeah. 90% of the land owned by the government.
And housing happen.
Exactly. Yeah. 85% of housing supplied by the government. Yeah. So it's the kind of at the deeper level a socialist country. Yeah, but. When Singapore first started industrialization in the 60s, what was it? No one took it seriously, but they kept kind of developing kind of productive capabilities targeted at certain sectors. They did a lot of these deals with individual companies, please come to us, but tell us exactly what you want. Then we are going to do our best to provide the right infrastructure, right workforce. So I think that different countries will have to
deal with it differently.
Deal with this differently. But I don't believe that. There's nothing you can do.
The door has not been shut.
Yeah.
Let's turn to the third aspect, which is financialization.
Yeah, that's the scary part. I don't know what to do. Yeah, because in the name of the liberating the world from financial repression, as they used to be called in the 1980s, we have liberalized these financial markets, abolished, well, not all, but a lot of financial borders, to create this global monster, which is really eating the world alive. There's some shocking statistics. For example, because of this the financial liberalization and deregulation, you have basically given enormous power to short-term shareholders. For example, in Britain, which already was the famous for having an overdeveloped financial sector and suffering from more short-term oriented nature by investors. Even in Britain, in the 1960s, the average period of shareholding was around 5 years. Now it's not even 1 year. Yeah. And how can you call someone who's not willing to commit to the company even for 1 year an owner of the company? But by law, these are the owners, and of course, the countries have modified this. In Germany, the power of these the shareholders are very seriously checked by the so-called co-determination system, where they have two-tier board structure. So they have the management board, which is same as board of directors in other companies in other countries. But they also have this thing called supervisory board, which is made half of members recommended by the employers, half of the members are recommended by the trade unions. Yeah, so these exist only for countries with more than, I think, 2,000 employees or 5,000 employees, big companies. But yeah, in these companies, the most important decisions have to be approved by supervisory board. Yeah? So if you want to do an mergers and acquisition or close down factory, it has to go through.
Or stock buybacks.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, it's tempered. It can be tempered, but at least in the U.S., in the U.K., I mean, this is unrestrained. Yeah. So these, what do these short-term shareholders do? I mean, they demand the highest possible dividends, highest possible share buybacks. So much so that, according to the data produced by the American economist Bill Lazonick, in the last couple of decades, the top 300, top 500 corporations in the US and the UK have given away somewhere between 90 and 95% of their profit to the shareholders in the form of profit dividends and share buybacks. Yeah?
And that little reinvested in the company.
Sorry?
If you distribute profits, you're unable to reinvest.
No, exactly, yeah. I mean, even in the US, which traditionally had high dividend rates, because, I mean, I'm talking only about the dividends, because even in the US, share buyback was less than 5% of company profit until the 80s, yeah? Now it's like 50%, 6%, yeah? And then in between that and the dividends, these companies are retaining like 5% of profit. Yeah? Even in the US in the 60s, until the 60s, maybe 70s, I don't have figures for 70s, somewhere between only 45 and 55% of the profits were distributed. Yeah? In Europe, it was much lower, yeah? Like 20%, something like that. Yeah. Now they have no money to invest. Yeah.
So in this context, what are the prospects for industrial policy in terms of reciprocity, right? Because that's such an important part, that if they do get both FDI, in a sense, the distinction between FDI and domestic ownership doesn't matter, because in most cases it comes as short-term capital.
Exactly, yeah.
So there,
yeah, and even the FDI can be turned into short-term capital, because sometimes these companies make investment and then with foreign currency, yeah, and then borrow money from domestic banks using the factories as collateral and take the money out. Yeah? So actually, there's very little net investment. Yeah. Anyway, so in this kind of situation, with I hear that with the Inflation Reduction Act (IRA) in the U.S., they managed to put in this clause that if you get these subsidies for microchips or whatever,
Capital subsidies,
yeah,
investment subsidies.
you cannot, while you are receiving it, you cannot do share buybacks. Yeah? So at least that's like the minimum, yeah, that you have to do, because that you don't want, yeah, in the same way that foreign investors come in and borrow money and then, yeah, shipping it out. I mean, if you give subsidies to these companies, and if the shareholders take it out, then what's the point? Yeah. So I think yeah, this has made the U.S. government realize that you cannot just give the kind of one-way subsidies. You need to get something in return, reciprocity, as the late Ellie Sampson put it beautifully, you know. But you know, the problem is that with this the financialization, so I've just talked about it weakening the ability of corporations to make productive investment. But secondly, it also has basically created macroeconomic environment in which governments find it very difficult to invest in the long term through borrowing, because these guys, as soon as someone runs at higher than expected deficit, they swoop down on them and try to savage them. Yeah, sometimes it is the right thing, like the savaging least trust is idiotic plan, but you know, very often it's basically making governments very reluctant to, if you like, invest for the future, because if you want to invest in infrastructure, education, or whatever, to increase future productivity, and if you borrow money to do that, then this the extremely powerful financial sector will swoop down on you and make it difficult. Yeah? So it has also created this the short-term bias towards government's macroeconomic management. Huh?
Including, I believe, tax cuts, direct tax cuts.
Yeah.
Both India underwent about the most severe corporate tax cuts, and Sri Lanka just before the economic crisis.
Yeah, but this idea that the low corporate tax is a good thing in itself, I think is such an idiotic idea that it needs to be abolished. Because, you know, when people say that, oh, we need to cut corporation tax, my response is to talk about Paraguay. Yeah? This the small South American countries that, yeah, for like 35 years that was ruled by this military dictator called General Stroessner. Yeah. You know, Paraguay has 10% flat corporation tax rate, 10% flat income tax rate. Yeah. So according to the mainstream logic, every company should move to Paraguay. Every rich person should move to Paraguay. But they don't do that. Why? Because they may pay low price, but the service they get in return is not good. Yeah, yeah. So you know, the workers are not well trained. The infrastructure sucks. Yeah, there's a lot of crime. Yeah, yeah. So companies would rather pay 30% corporation tax in Germany and do business there. Yeah, yeah, I mean okay, I mean, there are these tax exiles, but a lot of rich people would, I mean, not in the US anymore, because the tax for the rich people there is even lower than for poor people. But in Europe, you know, a lot of rich people would pay 50, 60% tax and live in you know, Sweden and Denmark, because they like how
Living
the
there.
country is run. Yeah. Whereas they wouldn't want to go to
Paraguay.
Paraguay, simply because tax is lower. Yeah?
But
So I think it's a stupid logic, but you are right. I mean, this logic is being bombarded into every government in the world. I mean,
But you still feel that there is room for industrial policy, which is sort of deliberate state action, even within this through negotiation. And therefore, that brings me to internal conditions. Because the state would play a large role in these negotiations, even in sort of restricting the influence of finance capital or otherwise. So, your reflections on the nature of the state. This is not a binary between democracy and non-democracy. That's not my question. It's what's the nature of the state that's more likely to deliver on industrial policy as a transformative set of instruments than otherwise given today's conditions?
Yeah, very good question. You know, seeing the success of industrial policy in countries like Korea and Taiwan, which until the 80s was very brutal military dictatorships, a lot of people try to argue against industrial policy, saying that you can't do it unless you have autocracy. Yeah? This is empirically completely wrong because Japan itself, but also France, Finland, Norway, Austria. Until the 80s, these countries, despite being the fully functioning democracies, had industrial policies that were, probably a bit less extreme, but basically of the same type as those of Korea and Taiwan. Yeah? What is necessary, therefore, is the political consensus that there is the need for a long-term vision, long-term roadmap, broadly, that transcends the individual administrations. Yeah? Now, exactly what that vision is, exactly how is going to implement it, I mean, that will have to be modified according to the changes in the administration, but it is important to have that agreement that there is something that transcends individual regimes. Yeah, I mean, there are things that need to be done with a time horizon of 10 years, 20 years, maybe even 30 years. I mean, climate change is actually making people accept that, yes, that we really need to find a way to go beyond these electoral cycles and so on. As far as that you have that consensus, then there'll be less kind of attempt to wipe the slate clean every time a new government comes in. Yeah? This also requires institutionalizing some of these industrial policy bodies so that you have kind of institutional memory and the kind of mechanisms for dialogue and debate. Yeah,
And strategic learning.
exactly. Yeah, because it's one thing to say yes that we agree on this long-term vision set out in this paper called, I don't know, India 2050 or whatever. But if you just leave it there, then how are you going to implement it? Yeah? So you need to build this consultation bodies, the research institutes, maybe public, maybe joint private public, dedicated to looking at these long-term issues, sector issues, studying technological trends, yeah, studying market conditions, yeah, studying the most importantly what your potential competitors are doing, yeah. And only when you create these bodies, and there are lots of other bodies that you need to create, like industry associations, government, business, the forum for dialogue. There are lots of, I mean, you can go back to the experiences of countries which have had successful industrial policies like Germany and Japan and Korea and so on to see what kind of institutions you need. But you need to institutionalize this long-term vision in these the organizations and certain rules, because otherwise every government will come in and say, yes, great stuff, our 2055 report, but who's going to do it? Yeah?
The other aspect that you speak about, which might require state capacity, and please reflect on that, is conflict. Because industrial policy necessarily requires making some choices. It has distributional implications as well. And therefore, what's the nature of the state which can best manage conflict so as to keep industrial policy on the rails?
Yeah, no, that's a very important point. The thing is, industrial policy is a very explicitly targeted policy. There are clear beneficiaries. Yeah? So unless the rest of the population feel that the benefits are then percolating throughout the system, then they'll say, wow, I mean, you have developed an amazing electronic sector, but all the other sectors are dying. Yeah? Why are we doing this? Yeah? So you need a way to percolate the benefits. I mean, in some contexts, these were done kind of more or less automatically because, in China in the recent period, even though inequality was going through the roof, the economy is growing so fast. Even the poorest guy got to eat another bowl of rice and got to heat the room a bit more during the winter. So people accepted it. But now it's going to be different. Yeah? It's slowed down. The people are more educated. They need to find a way to share these benefits. And yeah, there are different ways of sharing these benefits. One of them was actually used in Japan, although not anymore, Korea, and interestingly Switzerland, which is basically to restrict the ability of the market to generate inequality by putting in a lot of regulations. Yeah? So
Of what nature?
yeah, so basically limiting the ability of the big guys to dominate. Yeah. So, for example, in Japan, in Korea, I mean, especially in retail sector, you had these regulations that, it was most extreme in Japan, not anymore, but in the old days, basically, if you want to set up a retail space of above a certain size, basically you have to bribe every other shop in the area, which made it extremely expensive. Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of small shops survived in that way. In Korea, until 1997, there was this law that reserved 138 also the industries for SMEs. Yeah.
Till 1997.
Yeah. So, for example, one of the things that large companies couldn't make in those days was tofu. Yeah. Because it was a relatively simple technology.
Industry.
Yeah. The big demand. Yeah. I mean, now, of course, the tofu making is dominated by these large companies. But yeah. So, and then, of course, we had that in East Asia in the 40s and 50s, land reform and land ownership, agricultural land ownership ceiling was very, very strictly imposed. So, a lot of very inefficient small farmers survived. Yeah? So, I mean, now Japan has basically broken out of that mold. In Korea is slowly crumbling, but still these regulations are strong enough to make Korea the most equal country in the OECD. before tax and transfer. Yeah? But we have such a small welfare state, the second smallest in the OECD after Mexico. Yeah? So among the rich countries, it's by far the smallest. And even that small welfare state is not highly redistributive. Yeah? So after tax and transfer, we become like a second or the third most unequal country in the OECD. Yeah? Now, the countries like Germany, Sweden, solve it in the other way. They basically let the market rip. Sometimes, if you look at before tax income distribution before tax and transfer, they are in some years more unequal than the U.S. Yeah?
It's amazing that you're saying an authoritarian regime in Korea did much more market shaping for egalitarian pre-distribution outcomes than democratic regimes in Europe, which had far less egalitarian incomes. I mean, this is income distribution.
Yeah,
It is
this is something that most people don't know. Yeah, and but in countries like Germany and Sweden, they redistribute so much through the welfare state. They end up being quite equal after tax and transfer. Yeah, so you need through some measure, some combination of these different measures need to spread the benefit. Yeah? And important in that story also is the system of social mobility through education and training and retraining, which Korea has done very, very badly. So now, until the 80s when the economy was growing fast and creating a lot of jobs and a lot of new jobs, better paid jobs, and so on. I mean, social mobility was really high. I mean, until the, say, 80s, you could be born in one of the poorest families in the rural area and become the president of the republic, the Supreme Court judge, top scientist. Now this is impossible. So this is what I just said is actually what the Korean movie Parasite is talking about. Yeah? Because these guys, the poor guys in the movie, they used to have okay jobs. Yeah? And then as they grow older, they get sacked. And then what do you do? I mean, there's no welfare state. You have to make a living. So you use your severance payment to run a fried chicken show, which goes bankrupt because there's excessive competition. And then you end up folding pizza boxes in the basement. Yeah. So anyway, actually, I gave a talk on the political economy of the movie Parasite, which is available on YouTube.
Okay.
So if you want, I gave two talks on that actually. Once in the online talks, once for LSE, another for University of Hawaii. I mean, the contents are the same, but both videos are on YouTube. Yeah.
But this is amazing that the most successful examples over the past half century on industrial policy are also the economies, despite whether authoritarian regimes or otherwise, ensured the best pre-tax distribution outcomes. In part, you were saying due to land reform, but also in part because they ensured that industrial transformation created enough jobs to absorb the workforce. And in fact, that's the challenge that a lot of the global south faces now, is whether industrial policies can generate as many jobs for this meaningful inclusion. And
so my view is that, of course, there's a limit imposed by the laws of the economy, but you can create jobs. Yeah.
But that should be deliberate.
It
doesn't
exactly,
happen. You need to
so that by basically banning large supermarket chains to open new shops. I mean, you create jobs for small retail shops. Yeah. I mean, that you can, introduce regulation for, I don't know, number of teachers per pupil in school, number of care workers in nursing homes, per patient, and then you can create jobs in those sectors.
But very often, in fact, the economy trends in the other direction. Say in India, a lot of the food distribution has actually shifted away from informal workers to formal corporates, with the digitalization of the economy. So we don't really know which way that goes unless you have deliberate industrial policy which also is concerned about job creation, you might have adverse distributional outcomes.
Yeah, so, you can, on the other hand, solve this by creating a stronger welfare system where people do not necessarily have to have jobs to to have a decent standard of living. But I am actually not that fond of that solution because work is an important part of the human identity. A lot of people feel quite useless if they get supported simply by transfer. And that kind of living standard is also so vulnerable to political changes. Look at Brazil. During the Workers' Party government, a lot of people got out of poverty because of Bolsa Familia and many other welfare schemes. Bolsonaro comes in with 5 strokes of pen. A lot of people go back into poverty. So the best way is to create jobs. Because
Sri Lanka is getting close to there too, because it also went into very high expenditure on welfare, and the crisis meant that recipients of welfare suffered the most. Also, would you also want to reflect that distribution is not just about political stability, but also you've argued elsewhere about distribution is also about the nature of demand, and therefore even the potential for technological diffusion.
Yeah, that's
as
right.
against the demand being concentrated in just a few elite.
Yeah, that if you have large market, you can, well, in the short run, achieve scale economy and thereby lower the cost. But secondly, more importantly, because you are operating in a large market, you have more opportunities for innovation and changes. So yeah, India should really take advantage of it because you have now the largest population in the world, and if you're not going to take advantage of it by spreading purchasing power and creating new demands, what is the large population for?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. It's like not as if there's one package that works for everyone. I think in India's political economy, you will need to learn about kind of more federal ways of managing industrial policy from Germany, which has actually very few federal industrial policy. A lot of policies are done at the state level. So that could be useful. Having said that, what is the population of UP? I mean, it's almost as big as Indonesia. So, yeah. It's a different dimension of the federalism. That's right. Yeah, but still, I mean, I think you can learn the more federalist industrial policy from Germany and certain parts of Italy. I mean, from the kind of Korea, you can not only learn about industrial policy, but about how to spread the benefit, how to create jobs. Because I mean, no way that you can create the best jobs for everyone. And frankly, a lot of these the important but underappreciated jobs in the sectors that provide care and basic services and so on, we need more of them. We need to pay those people better. And yeah, I mean, we should never accept what the market says we should accept, because market is what? I mean, $1, one vote. Yeah. No, during the pandemic, we've seen that, while millions of people were dying because they didn't have protective medical equipment, they didn't have enough oxygen, they didn't have enough testing equipment. These billionaires were having private space race. Yeah, I mean that's the ugliest face of the market. Yeah, I mean we shouldn't accept that. Yeah? So yeah, that if your new industries do not, I mean, some industries will, but if some of your new industries do not produce enough jobs, how are you going to create jobs? Yeah?
And therefore, how do you influence pre-tax, pre-transfer distribution, so that you have a politically more stable distribution arrangement? Well, thank you. Let's just turn to just the last, just your concluding observations on what this discussion and the contemporary explicit opening up of industrial policy means for both the theoretical framework of the economics discipline, which is currently dominant, as well as for the neoliberal paradigm. Just two or three key aspects which get challenged and which might need to be reviewed on the basis of current sort of dominant experience.
Yeah, yeah. I think from about, I don't know, 2005, 10, thereabout, there have been some neoclassical economists like Danny Roderick, Justin Lin, who have tried to promote industrial policy, but only things that are compatible with the neoclassical framework. Yeah? So they are not looking at the things like, what I call enterprise restructuring policy, because it doesn't really fit the neoclassical framework, yeah? Where there's no uncertainty, there's no fix, where but there's no what's the word? Yeah, wasteful competition that I mean, what we used to call in East Asia, yeah, so even with this renewed interest in the industrial policy, things that do not neatly fit the neoclassical framework have been neglected. Yeah. Also, even things, yeah, another important thing that has been neglected is the importance of building capabilities. Yeah? Because, yeah, the neoclassical economists do talk about it a bit through R&D training and things like that, the so-called public goods, yeah, that will be undersupplied by the market. But it's really more than that. It's about creating new kind of political consensus, mechanisms of sharing benefits, yeah, sustaining the job creation, I mean, that bigger political economy question that has to be combined with R&D training and these technical things, that once again, because it doesn't fit the neoclassical market failure framework easily, that are not discussed. So yes, I mean, I think it's a good thing that finally, talking about industrial policies legitimate, even among, well, not all, but many neoclassical economists. But I think that they need to recognize that they have still, I mean, a lot of areas that they need to pay attention to. Yeah?
Including shaping markets.
Exactly,
right? I mean,
shaping
IRA
markets.
shapes the energy
Yeah.
market in the US. Similarly in Europe, in Japan, as you said, and South Korea, markets themselves were
Yeah.
shaped. The nature through
Exactly,
which
yeah.
the economic decisions were taken.
Yeah, and in sticking to this concept of comparative advantage, they are basically ignoring that what is most important is that building productive capabilities, because the neoclassical comparative advantage framework assumes that capabilities are actually the same. Yeah?
Static.
Yeah, no. The same across countries. Yeah?
I see.
Because the technologies are treated as a blueprint. Yeah? And what you have to specialize is determined by your factor endowment, capital and labor. Yeah? So if Guatemala is not producing BMWs, it's not because it cannot, but because it doesn't make economic sense. Yeah. So if you put it like that, probably many neoclassical economists will say, "Oh, we really don't mean that," but that's the obvious implication of your theory, and they really need to get away from that and at least talk about comparative advantage in the way that David Ricardo originally talked about, which was about technologies, yeah? Technological differences. Only that he saw it as static. Yeah?
Whereas you're looking at it historically shaped, so you can actually shape it.
Yeah, and they evolve, and you can shape the way that they evolve, and so on. Yeah, yeah. So there are all these kind of deeper issues of the capabilities, technologies, political economy, distribution, jobs that need to be thought of as a kind of package, which these people are not looking at. And yeah, I think the unfortunate thing is that no theory can, explain everything. No theory has a comprehensive perspective. So I'm not saying that my theories are in all respects better than neoclassical theory, but these people need to accept that their theory is not capable of handling some of these issues. But unfortunately, unless you talk about these things with neoclassical language and do the empirical studies with the tools that they think are legitimate,
You're shut out.
they don't accept it. Yeah? Now, having said that, I think that this revival of industrial policy and acceptance of it by increasing number of neoclassical economics, it is the kind of undermining the status of neoliberal thinking, because the neoliberalism and neoclassical economics are not the same, as you know. Yeah. So Danny Roderick, Paul Krugman, Joe Stiglitz, they are
Not neoliberals.
neoclassical
Yeah.
economists, but they are not neoliberal. Yeah? But insofar as neoliberalism drew its the kind of theoretical legitimacy from neoclassical economics, neoclassical economists that kind of moving away from this free market ideology, I think is undermining neoliberalism. But I try to live by the dictum of Antonio Gramsci, the pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will is what we need. So I'm actually quite pessimistic about the prospect of neoliberalism being legitimized, because there's so much power and money at stake. Yeah? It just is not going to kind of, it's not an intellectual debate, is it? Yeah, that whatever evidence they are given, these people will say, well, that's your opinion. That we still think free market and free trade are the best. Yeah. So we have a lot of fight at our hands, and of course, the kind of there's a limit to what you can do with academic discourse, and therefore we need to kind of link it with the practical policies, bigger political discourse, yeah, power issues, distribution struggle, yeah.
And optimism of the will.
Yes, but
Thank
we
you
will
very
do
much.
it. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ha-Joon, for being patient and for being quite sort of, what should I say, candid in your responses. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.